Hello, guys. Today, we're diving into 7 terrifying Christmas stories found on Reddit. From eerie winter nights to unsettling holiday encounters, these chilling tales will make you look at Christmas in a whole different way. Get comfortable and prepare yourself for a dark and haunting journey through the festive season. Every Christmas Eve, we throw a holiday party. No one is allowed to leave for 48 hours. 1 hour till midnight, John shouted as he ran through the living room. I glanced towards the small closet in the hallway. The door had been removed and propped up against the opposite wall, as usual, and the mistletoe had been hung up in the center of the doorway. The closet was empty, and there was no light coming from inside. I held onto my glass of water, nervous. I never drank at the annual holiday party. The things we were about to see were bad enough sober, and I couldn't even imagine what it would be like if I were drunk. I looked over at Mel, who was smoking a joint as she did every year. I'm not sure how she managed to get through the events of the night, but maybe being high helped her to process what she saw. John ran back through the living room, stopping to make sure that all of the windows were locked and all of the curtains were shut. He walked over to the front door, rattling the doorknob and pulling on the door to make sure that it too was locked before making his way into the kitchen. The rest of us, Ben, Alma, Mel, and I, sat around the living room in silence. Even though we had done this every year for the last 3 years, it wasn't something you could easily get used to. The horrors that we would witness tonight wouldn't be anything like the horrors from last year or the year before. We took over this ritual from our parents, who had passed it on to us when we turned 18. Ever since then, we have made sure that every year on Christmas Eve, we gather at John's house to make sure that we keep all of the holiday horrors away from the rest of you. The drugs and the food are only here to distract us, although it hardly ever works. We all gather on the day before Christmas Eve, a few minutes before midnight, and we stay inside John's house until midnight on Christmas night. It doesn't always start at the same time, but never before 1 p.m. on Christmas Eve, so we always make sure that we are inside the house and that all the exits are locked tight before the fun starts. I use the word fun very loosely here. I set my glass of water down as Mel passed by me, letting us know she was going to pee before it all started. She came back fairly quickly and plopped back down on the couch, sighing. Mel was always annoyed that we had to do this. She didn't seem as affected by it as the rest of us and would usually spend most of the month of December complaining about the holiday party. "John," Ben shouted suddenly, "it's starting!" I looked back at the closet. Ben was right, it was starting. And standing in the threshold under the mistletoe was a creature whose top half was a reindeer with the bottom half of a nude human male. It stood there looking towards us. Its head had a big hole where its left eye should have been, as if it had been shot there, and there was dried blood all over its face. Its left antler was broken in half, and I could see some bugs crawling around the wound in its face. "What the fuck is that?" Alma whispered. No one replied. We just stood there, watching it, as it watched us. It retreated back into the closet before it got down on all fours and charged towards us. I still flinched, even though I knew it couldn't make it more than a few feet away from the mistletoe. I remember asking my parents once why we had to make sure that all the exits were locked, even though most of the monsters couldn't get more than a few feet away from the mistletoe. They didn't give me a direct answer, only that making sure that everything was locked guaranteed that nothing would get out. "Jesus fucking Christ," Mel shouted. It continued to charge towards us, ramming into the invisible berries each time. Then, just as it had randomly appeared, the creature randomly disappeared, and there was a few minutes of empty silence. No one said a word, but we all watched as the next creature appeared. This one was human, but there was something wrong with him, as usual. The man had been flattened out to resemble the shape of a gingerbread man. He had large, rotting gumdrops that were meant to be a gingerbread buttons sewn down his front. His mouth had been pulled back at the corners with some sort of metal hoops that pierced through his skin in order to give him a permanent smile. He waddled from side to side as he attempted to balance on his flattened feet. As he tried to walk out of the closet, his arms got stuck in the doorway and he ran into it over and over again, slamming himself into it harder and harder each time until there was a sickening crunching noise and his arms flopped backwards. He finally waddled through the doorway, and this time he made it out further than the first creature had and began waddling towards us. "Fuck this," Ben said, leaping behind the couch to take cover. I took a few steps back as the man continued to waddle towards the living room. Suddenly, a branch pierced through his chest from the back, and he was violently pulled back into the closet where he disappeared. That was immediately followed by dozens of branches that snaked their way around the floor of the house, climbing up the walls as they made their way around the house. The branches were covered in the sharpest pine needles I'd ever seen, with a few random broken ornaments hanging off of them. I jumped up onto a couch as the branches made their way into the living room, and everyone else followed my lead as we watched the branches weave in and out of the floorboards. Suddenly, Alma screamed, and I turned towards her. Some of the branches had wrapped around the legs of the chair she was on, and she was being pulled towards the closet. John attempted to reach out for her as she was dragged past him, but the branches began to snake up and intertwine until they created a sort of protective dome around the chair, trapping Alma inside. She continued to yell as I tried to figure out a way to get to her without the branches getting to me, but it seemed impossible. It was like the branches had a mind of their own and were making sure that none of us could help Alma. We watched as she was dragged into the closet along with the chairs before the branches finally retreated. "What was that? They've never taken any of us before," Ben said. No one replied as we continued to watch the closet. Suddenly, Alma leaped out and ran out, but was stopped a few feet away from the doorway. "What?" she shouted, panicked. "Let me out!" John leapt off the coffee table and ran over, grabbing hold of Alma's hand and attempting to pull her away from the doorway, but he couldn't. "Don't leave me here! Please, help me!" Alma sobbed.
Ben ran over and tried to help John, but something was holding Alma back and stopping them from pulling her away. "Ow!" Alma shouted suddenly. I ran over as Mel followed. "What happened?" I asked. "Did we pull too hard?" John asked Alma. "Ow!" Alma shouted again, louder this time. "Alma, what's wrong?" I asked. "It hurts," she shouted as she fell to her knees. We watched as she continued to shout in pain, and then we realized what was happening. Her skin was being peeled off in one large chunk. Her biceps had been exposed as the skin continued to peel from the back to the front until everything, including her face, came off. Alma continued to scream the whole time, even after her skin was off. Her skin began crawling towards us as she screamed and cried in the background, and it started to make sense why John's parents had told him to find a remote area to host the parties at. We began to back away as her skin continued to crawl towards us. I soon realized that it was heading towards John specifically, and he backed into a wall as it continued to snake towards him, climbing up his body. It was at this point that I realized that Alma had stopped screaming, and I turned just in time to see her limp body being dragged back into the closet. It looked like she was dead. I started to get anxious then. None of the things we witnessed had ever affected us this much. Usually some of us would walk away with some scratches, but nothing this permanent. I took a deep breath as I tried to ignore the voice in the brain that was screaming at me to get out of the house as soon as possible. But I knew that I couldn't. I couldn't let all of these things into the world. I turned back to look at John as Alma's skin began wrapping itself around his torso until it tightened and formed a weird skin sweater around him. John started to gag, and I looked away as I felt the urge to vomit. John began freaking out, and I looked back to see him attempting to peel the skin sweater off his body. Every time he pulled part of it off, it began to bleed until his hands and legs were covered in blood. He started to cry, scratching at Alma's skin as he tried desperately to peel it off. It did come off eventually, and John kicked it aside as he ran into the kitchen. I heard the faucet open as he continued crying. "Oh God." I turned at the sound of Ben's voice to see small elves walking out of the closet. They were dressed in typical green outfits, but they were severely deformed, with different sized heads, arms, and legs. We watched as they all headed towards the pile of Alma's skin. They began to pick it up as she tore off pieces of it with their teeth and ate it until it was all gone. Then they got on the floor and licked up all the blood before returning back into the closet. "There's only 5 minutes left until midnight," Ben said, breaking the silence. "Do you think it's over then?" I asked. "No," Mel replied. I looked over to see that she was pointing at the closet. I could hear footsteps coming from inside. "Do you feel that?" John asked. I turned, not noticing that he had come back from the kitchen. We stood still as I began to notice that the house was getting cold. It continued to drop in temperature until my teeth were chattering. The footsteps continued even though nothing appeared. I rubbed my arms as I tried to warm up and began to notice a thin layer of ice appearing on every item in the house. For the next few minutes, the house continued to grow colder and colder until I was sure that we were going to die. I could feel my heartbeat slow down as my fingers turned blue. My eyes had started to burn from the cold, and I could no longer move. Then, just when I thought it was all over, it was gone, and the house warmed up in the blink of an eye. "Is it over?" I asked. "Yeah, it's midnight," Ben replied. "Where's Alma?" John asked. I carefully walked over to the closet, peering inside. It was empty. There was no sign of Alma anywhere. "What the fuck happened?" I asked. "I don't know," John replied. "This has never happened before," Ben said. "She's dead. There's nothing we can do about it," Mel replied curtly. She began to gather her stuff, and we watched as he threw open the front door and left, slamming the door shut behind her. "What do we tell her parents?" John asked. "I don't know," I shrugged. "I should get going too," Ben said suddenly. I could tell that he was about to cry, and I stepped out of his way as he left the house. I could feel tears welling up in my eyes, and I excused myself as I ran upstairs and shut the bathroom door behind me. I splashed cold water on my face as I tried to make sense of what had happened. I wondered why this time had been different. As I racked my brain for reasons, I felt a sudden chill as I noticed it was abnormally cold in the bathroom. I turned around as I heard a car start and stood there staring at the open bathroom window. My heart began to hammer against my chest as my thoughts ran a million miles a minute. I walked over to the window and glanced down just in time to see Alma's car backing out of the driveway. Confused, I stuck my head out the window and squinted as I tried to make out the driver. As the car turned out into the street, I got a direct view into the driver's seat where I saw a skinned, blistering red Alma drive off down the road.
My family has a Christmas tradition I wish I never questioned. Growing up, Christmas was magical. The tree glowing softly in the corner, the smell of gingerbread wafting through the house, and the laughter of my family made it feel like nothing could ever go wrong. But there was one tradition that always felt off. Every Christmas Eve, just before bed, my parents would gather us around the fireplace. They'd turn off all the lights except for the glow of the fire and hand each of us a small bell. "Shake it once for Santa," Dad would say with a smile. "He needs to hear you." So we did. We'd each shake our bells in unison, filling the room with soft jingling, and then my parents would blow out the fire. And that was it. When I was young, I never thought twice about it, but as I got older, I started to notice strange things. The next morning, the fire would always be relit, even though no one got up to do it. There were faint, charred handprints on the bricks surrounding the fireplace. One year, when I was about 12, I asked my mom why we did it. Her face turned pale. "It's just tradition," she said, brushing me off. But that answer wasn't enough. Last Christmas, I decided to stay up. I was 16 and too curious for my own good. My parents and little brother had gone to bed, the house was silent, and the fire had been snuffed out. I sat in the dark, the faint scent of smoke lingering in the air, waiting. At first, nothing happened. I almost gave up and went to bed. Then, I heard it. A faint jingling, like someone shaking a bell far off in the distance. I froze. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was coming from the chimney itself. I held my breath, staring at the dark opening, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Something moved. I didn't see it first, but I felt it. The cold draft that followed as a tall, gaunt figure emerged from the chimney. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its head bent to fit under the low ceiling. Its skin was ashen, flaking, with dark burns trailing up its arms, and it was holding a bell. It raised the bell slowly and shook it once. The sound sharp and clear in the silent room. I couldn't move. Its head turned toward me, hollow eyes boring into mine. A jagged smile spread across its face as it whispered in a voice that sounded like crackling fire. "You're not supposed to watch." The room went black. I woke up in my bed the next morning, trembling, my clothes reeking of smoke. My parents acted like nothing had happened, but when I went downstairs, I saw a fresh set of charred handprints on the fireplace and a bell sitting on the mantel. I haven't shaken a bell since, but every Christmas Eve, I hear it. And every year, it gets louder.
A spy cam in my Christmas tree caught more than just Santa. Last year on Boxing Day, I found a really cool ornament in a clearance box. It had a built-in camera to record a unique perspective on your holiday celebrations. I grabbed the last one from the store's dusty shelf and brought it home for less than $10. I forgot about it until my wife, my 2 daughters, and I decorated the house earlier this month. I told my daughters about the camera and said we'd secretly catch Santa in the act. I had an old costume in the attic and intended to deliver some gifts in full view of the camera on Christmas night. My girls were overjoyed and went back and forth trying to find the best place to put the ornament on the tree. They had no idea Daddy repositioned it later so it could actually catch the living room at a good angle. In the nights leading up to Christmas, I turned the camera on to make sure everything was working properly. In the morning, I previewed the footage just long enough to confirm the thing was working. Satisfied, I inserted the micro SD card back into the ornament and slipped in a new battery in anticipation for the big night. Daddy didn't want to disappoint his girls with a failed recording. We enjoyed Christmas Eve as a family, playing board games and eating way more junk food than there was room in our stomachs. Like we do every year, we let our daughters open one gift for Mommy and Daddy before going to bed. The girls, still riding their sugar high, could be heard giggling in their bedrooms from all the way up the stairs. From time to time, my wife and I could hear one of them shush the other, claiming she'd heard hoofs on the roof or bells jingling. Eventually, our kiddos dozed off. My wife kissed me on the cheek and headed to bed while I turned off all the lights. I retrieved the costume and tiptoed to the living room, getting ready for my big feature film debut. I did everything you would expect Santa to do. I ate most of the cookies, I drank the milk, I pet my large stomach and said my HOHOs, and I dropped a few presents by the fireplace, all in full view of the camera. A pretty good acting job, if I do say so myself. On Christmas morning, the girls came running into our bedroom to wake us up. They excitedly insisted we watch the video before opening the presents. I transferred the footage to my laptop, forwarded to where Santa showed app, and pressed play. My girls squealed with delight and jumped in front of the screen, frantically waving at Santa while obscuring the video from my view. It brought me so much joy to see how happy the girls were. I was too lazy to stop the video, so it continued to play in the background while we unwrapped our gifts. I spotted a box I had not seen the night before. It was a small and wrapped in a blue foil paper I did not recognize. My name was on it, but my wife seemed as surprised as I was to see it there. Noticing my confusion, my youngest daughter spoke. "Daddy, that's gotta be from Mr. Elf," she said, her voice cheerful and bright. I was ready to dismiss her elf comment as just another weird thing kids say, but my wife wasn't too quick to ignore it. "Honey, what elf?" she asked. My daughter pointed to the laptop. By then, the video had ended and all that was left on the screen was a preview of the first frame. "The one that came with Santa," she answered. Panic struck me like a bird in a jet propeller. I know my wife didn't dress up as an elf. I scanned the video, clicking forward and back until I saw what my daughter had seen. There was someone in the living room. He walked into the corner after I had turned the lights off. He stood there watching me parading around as Santa. The video went completely quiet after that. It was as though the camera failed to record a single sound. The strange, tall man in an elf costume stood perfectly still for over an hour, watching the camera from a distance. After a while, he walked over to the plate of cookies and bit the head off a gingerbread man. I glanced at the plate and saw his teeth mark on the decapitated cookie. The man then quietly approached the Christmas tree. I thought the audio wasn't working, but as he reached the tree, I began hearing his slow and steady breaths. He reached towards the ornament and the video stopped. In a terrified frenzy, I grabbed the blue box he'd left behind. I ripped the bow off of it and tossed the frilly thing away. I frantically removed the wrapping paper, opened the box, and looked inside. There, on a bed of bubble wrap, was the battery I'd put in the camera the night before. My wife took the ornament and opened the back. The battery was missing. I don't know what scares me more, what the camera caught or what the elf might have done after he turned off the camera.
Thomas Shea is a psychopath. At the age of 10, he was given an IQ test by one of his teachers on a hunch. He scored a 124 and was immediately moved into the school's gifted program. Over the next few years, his teachers would refer to him as a model student, while the school psychologist would note worrying aspects of his personality. At the age of 15, he would commit a crime that would shock our small Connecticut town: a brutal attempted murder on my brother, Kevin Collins. Between all of the theories surrounding Thomas Shea and the possible reasons behind the attack, there was only one constant: my sister, Sarah Collins. My sister Sarah was the middle child between me and my older brother Kevin. At 9, she fell in love with volunteering at a local animal shelter and would spend the next few years involved with some kind of charity work. This, combined with her overly friendly attitude, led to her fellow students to nickname her Saint Sarah. She was an artist who often said, "Beauty can be found in the ugliest places. All you have to do is look at it with the right eyes." She excelled at most subjects, even though most of her time was spent doodling in her notebook. When she was 11, my brother Kevin bought her first camera. The walls of her bedroom were soon covered with photographs she had taken in the woods around our neighborhood. That was the same year she first met Thomas. He was sitting alone at a lunch table when she decided he looked like he needed someone to talk to. A simple act of kindness turned into daily lunch meetings as an unlikely friendship grew. Tommy spent a lot of time with my sister in and out of school. He came over more and more and would stick around well past the established neighborhood curfew of when the streetlights turn on. When he was 14, he would often eat dinner over our house, yet he remained distant to everyone in my family except Sarah. When a conversation began, he would continue chewing his food while leveling his steel gray eyes at the speaker. Even at a young age, he had the ability to silence someone with just a look. And when the specter of Thomas Shea was at our table, our meals became much less talkative. Tommy would help clean the dishes before he joined Sarah out on our back porch for another hour or so of quiet talking. The last time I ever saw Thomas was on Christmas Eve when I was 8 years old. I was sitting beside our decorated tree playing with a doll my parents had let me unwrap before they went out to a coworker's party. My game was interrupted by 3 sharp knocks. I got up off the ground and went into the foyer to answer the door. I pulled it open with the chain still latched to see Tom standing in the cold December air. "Hey, Kelsey, can I come in?" I closed the door and pulled the chain off before reopening it. Tommy stepped inside, stomping the snow off of his boots onto our welcome mat. "Is Kevin around?" he asked. I nodded yes. "He's upstairs on his computer. Why do you want to see him?" I already knew the answer. Kevin had recently become more outspoken about Sarah seeing Tommy. He believed she was too good for him. That, combined with Tommy's reputation, had convinced Kevin that any kind of relationship between the two of them would end in violence. He spent the next few days persuading my parents that the only way to protect Sarah was to ban her from seeing her favorite son of a criminal. They agreed, and Thomas Shea was no longer allowed into the Collins family home. Yet, here he was. Tommy knelt down so he was face to face with me. "Do you still like singing?" he asked. The flat tone of his voice sent a chill down my spine. Yeah, I responded, masking a growing fear. "Good. Can you sing a song? A Christmas carol?" "Sure. How about, Good King Wenceslas?" "That's good. Stay down here, and no matter what you hear, keep singing. As loud as you can." I could only nod in understanding. Tommy stood up and walked toward the staircase. He grabbed the railing and turned back around to face me. The look he gave me was a silent command. Get out. I sprinted back to the living room and jumped onto the one couch we had that couldn't be seen from the foyer. I spun around and stared directly at the wall standing between him and me. Even with wood, sheetrock, and paint separating us, I could feel him there. "Good King Wenceslas looked out on the feast of Stephen, when the snow lay round about, deep and crisp and even. Brightly shone the moon that night, though the frost was cruel, when a poor man came in sight, gathering winter fuel." Footsteps began to slowly ascend the steps. "Hither, page, and stand by me, if thou knows it telling. Yonder peasant, who is he? Where and what his dwelling? Sire, he lives a good league hence, underneath the mountain, right against the forest fence of St. Agnes Fountain." The footsteps stopped. Everything inside me screamed, "Do something." I don't know if that something was to shout a warning, run and call the police, or roll over and start crying. Fear stopped my thoughts at "do something." "Bring me flesh and bring me wine, bring me pine logs hither. Thou and I shall see him dine, when we bear them hither." Voices came from Kevin's room, hushed at first, but slowly growing louder. "Page and monarch, forth they went together." The voices turned to shouts, through the wind's wild lament, and the bitter weather. The shouts turned to yells, then came a sickening dull crack. I stopped singing as crack after muffled crack filled the house. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then an eerie silence. I raised my voice, while all of the courage I could muster forced me to slowly get off the couch. "Sire, the night is darker now, and the wind blows stronger. Fails my heart, I know not how. I can go much longer." I tiptoed into the foyer and to the base of the stairs. "Mark my footsteps now, my page. Tread thou in them boldly.
My trembling hand met the banister as I pulled myself onto the first step. Tread thou in them boldly, thou shalt find the winter's rage, freeze thy blood less coldly. At this point, my song was more of a security blanket than a result of Tommy's command. In his master's steps he trod, where the snow lay dinted, step after eternal step, and I reached the landing in the middle of the stairs. Another series of dull cracks caused me to wince before I continued my journey. Heat was in the very sod, which the saint had printed. I got to my brother's bedroom door and slowly moved towards the handle, another crack followed by a muffled scream. My song was little more than a whimper now. Therefore, Christian men be sure, wealth or rank possessing. I gripped the door handle so tight I thought my fingers would snap. I put all of my strength into pushing the door open. Tommy stood in the middle of my brother's room over a writhing Kevin. Blood speckled the dark blue walls black and turned the white ceiling into a gory mosaic. In his right hand, he held the claw hammer that had covered my sibling's back with inch-wide holes. Kevin's body contorted as every muscle pulled against each other. He gasped like a fish pulled onto dry land, with an empty gaze locked on his attacker. That wasn't the worst part. The worst was the cold gray eyes staring at me through blood-matted hair. Without a word, Tommy slammed the door shut. I don't remember anything after that, or before that, for that matter. Everything but my impromptu caroling was a blur. I was found in the hallway sobbing next to my brother's bedroom door, being comforted by my sister. Kevin was a high school quarterback. He was popular, with more friends than I could possibly remember at the time. He worked a part-time job for money he mostly spent on my sister and me. He was the life to any party, event, or even room he entered, and he had also just celebrated his 18th birthday. He survived the attack, but he'd never play football or do much else again. He would spend the rest of his days being fed through a tube and grasping at the brightly painted mobile my parents hung over his bed. The same one he had when he was in his cradle, my teary-eyed mother would tell me. Tommy was arrested at his house wearing the same clothes he wore during the attack. He was tried as a minor and placed in a mental institution. Just like the school psychologist had predicted years earlier, he showed no remorse.
I privately blamed Sarah. She was the one who invited a monster into our home.
Sarah's personality flipped. She became quiet and withdrawn. The only people she talked to were the junior and senior burnouts. Drugs replaced art. Her good girl image changed to baggy black hoodies and dirty jeans. One night, I walked into her room to see her passed out on her bed, still wearing the same clothes she had snuck out in. The entire room stank like weed and beer. But that wasn't what infuriated me. In her arms was a stuffed teddy bear Tommy had won her at the Big E, a plastic star pinned to its chest, a tiny white cowboy hat sewn to its head, and a mocking smile stared at me from across the room. I never hated anyone as much as I did her in that moment. My parents told me to lay off my sister, but I couldn't. Every time I looked at her, I saw Kevin lying on the floor of his bedroom. She was the reason Kevin was in a bed instead of in college. She was why Dad had a mistress now. She was why Mom drank more than usual. She knew it too. One night, I woke up to the feeling of someone watching me. I lifted myself off of my bed as my eyes adjusted to the darkness. A dark figure sat on the toy box across me, fumbling with something in its hands. "Hey," Sarah's weak voice called. "Get out of here," I muttered. I could see her bow her head as she seemed to do so often those days. "I just need you to listen to me, Kel. Please." I fell back onto my pillow and locked my eyes towards the bedroom door. "Get out," I hissed back. She sat silent for a moment before speaking back up. "I know you hate me. Right now I hate me. But She gave an exasperated sigh. "I'm sorry." She stood up and placed whatever was in her hands on top of the toy box. Her footsteps were soft as she made her way across the room. She quietly opened the door, and I saw my sister for the last time. I will never forget how she looked at me that night, even though I can never find the right word to describe it. "I love you, Kelsey," were the last words my sister would ever say to me. With a quiet click of my door handle, she disappeared from my life. She was 17 years old. She ran away from home that night.
There would be a massive police search, but it would turn up nothing. I didn't care. I didn't even tell my parents about her late-night farewell. That wasn't my sister who left. It was the person who nearly got my brother killed. She had left a neatly wrapped box on my toy chest before she took flight. I took one look at it and threw it into my dresser drawer. I never wanted to spend another moment wasted on Sarah Collins. Years flew by and I left for college, hoping to escape my parents' constant fighting. I kept my past hidden from everyone except my boyfriend Mike. All of those years, and I was still angry at her. I decided the day after she left I would never end up like Sarah. In all of those years, I never even so much as drank, let alone touched any kind of drug. My life wasn't going to amount to a murderer and a failed police search. The year that I had decided I had finally put my life together was the year it all fell apart. It was Christmas time again when I found myself shopping in the Danbury Mall. I had brought presents for my parents, my close friends, and was in the process of buying a gift for Mike. We had a running joke between the two of us about how we were going to stop being adults and just live in the blanket fort. And I had come to the conclusion a perfect gift for him would be the first pieces of building materials. I was standing in the bedding section of a JCPenney's when a group of carolers caught my ear. "Sire, the night is darker now, and the winds blow stronger. Fails my heart, I know not how, I can go much longer." It's strange what will unlock an old memory. A smell, a sound, seeing a familiar face. In my case, it was a Christmas carol and the sight of white linen sheets. The bag I was holding dropped to my side as every little detail came rushing back. Sarah was at the house that night. She had told me Tommy was coming by and to let him in. Then she went somewhere. She was in the basement. Why was she in the basement? She was crying. I remember that now. But she was doing something else. Laundry. She was doing laundry. She had to clean her bed sheets. She told me it was because she had gotten hurt playing with Kevin. No, Kevin told me that. It wasn't the first time. "Mark my footsteps, good my page. Tread thou in them boldly. Thou shalt find the winter's rage. Freeze they blood less coldly." All of the skeletons came screaming out of the closet. Tiny memories that seemed so insignificant at the time played one after another. Kevin smiling and handing me a CD I really wanted. "I don't see why I can't play with you guys," I asked him. "It's a grown-up game." I fell to my knees, a memory of Sarah and I talking alone in her room. "Why do you like Tommy? He's weird," a much younger me asked. She put her pen down and thought for a moment. "We help each other." Why was I just recalling this now? Kevin's bedroom door appeared before me. Behind it, Kevin and Sarah. "Don't tell anyone," I heard Kevin say a decade ago. I threw my hand over my mouth. "Oh my God, Sarah." I muttered. I screamed so loud the entire store fell silent. I jumped and ran out of the store to my car. I ran every red light until I was back at my dorm room. "Hey babe, you get your shopping done?" Mike called from the kitchen. He turned the corner only to see me sobbing on the ground with my back against the door. He ran over and dropped down next to me. I didn't hear a word he said. All I saw was Sarah and I back in her room. "Okay, but he's scary and weird. Just saying." Sarah smiled and picked her pencil back up to continue her drawing. "Yeah, he is, but he's also kind. He listens to me. He watches out for me. I do the same for him and the same for you. We make each other better. Beauty can be found in the ugliest places." 8-year-old me snorted. "How can you be so positive all the time?" She capped her pencil against the pad. Sometimes hope is all you have. One day things will get better." I turned to my sister and she looked at me the same way she did the night she left. Despair. I had a word for it now. That weekend I went home the second time since I moved out. I went to my room and opened the dresser drawer. There was the still wrapped box from Sarah. I tore back the paper to see a framed photo of the two of us, me smiling as my big sister hugged me from behind. I turned the frame over to see a yellow note taped to the back of the photo. Remember us for what we were, not what we became. I know why my parents told me to lay off Sarah. I know why Tommy was tried as a minor for such a violent crime. I just know it too late. Mom and Dad didn't know what to say. Her own sister hated her because her boyfriend attacked her rapist. Sarah was truly alone. She was told every day with my icy glares and my parents' deafening quiet, it was her fault. How much would have changed if I knew she was the victim? How far would "it wasn't you" have gone? That's all I could think about as I stood over Kevin's bed. I have no idea how long I just looked at him debating whether or not I should finish Tommy's work. He woke up and lifted his head before I made a final decision. A sloppy smile spread across his lips as drool hit his pillow. I just stared at him. I wanted him to confess, to say I'm sorry, the same way his victim had the last night I saw her. But he didn't. He just smiled and drooled. I left without saying a word. I spent a few hours after I got back to my dorm room searching for Sarah Collins. I had this childish fantasy that kept playing over and over in my head. She probably cut her hair into one of those pixie cuts I see on all of the art students. When I found her, she'd be at an art gallery. Her photos would be hanging on every wall while patrons gawked at her genius. She'd be standing in the middle of the room talking to some investor through a smile, a glass of champagne sparkling next to a diamond wedding ring. Next to her would be Thomas Shea. He'd be standing awkwardly next to his wife in a gray suit that matched his eyes. I'd walk in and she'd recognize me instantly. I would apologize and she'd accept. We'd be a family again. A real, honest-to-God family. The fantasy ended when I saw her obituary. Her coping mechanisms had caught up with her. She died on an operating table trying to fix a badly damaged heart valve. I had missed her by 2 days. I went to her wake with Mike by my side, not knowing what to expect. Each step onto the carpet towards the viewing room was a milestone. Then the book caught my ear. Black pleather with photos written across it in gold lettering sitting in the middle of a white table by the door. I slowly lifted the cover. Inside was a collection of black and white photos she had taken over the years. I flipped through each picture, carefully admiring every detail. When I got to the last 2 pages, I couldn't help but smile. The left page held a photo of Sarah and Tommy standing side by side at the fair. Sarah held a familiar teddy bear in her left hand and Tommy's hand in her right. The right page was similar. The two of them sat at a white table outside of a cafe. She had her pixie cut. He had his suit. I flipped over the last page, hoping to see one more picture. Instead, a note was taped to the plastic sleeve of the cafe picture. Sarah Collins saw the good in everyone and everything, despite having a life that did everything it could to convince her otherwise. It was the Christmas of 1965, before man had landed on the moon, before the wall had fallen, before many things, good and bad. For me, it was the last time that I knew innocence, before the creeping shadow which engulfed my family, before the madness, before death, before. It was the Advent calendar, that damned thing which I had to have. Each door a promise of Christmas, and each window a misted reminder of the warmth and kindness of the festive season. I was 9 years old, and while the parents in my neighborhood would have had no fears for their children in the past, allowing them to play freely in the icy December streets, those days were lost like breath on a mirror. If snow had fallen, there would have been no joy, no snowball fights in the darkened evenings, no sledges sliding carefree down the fields nearby. Children could not be children. Though the young may have felt apprehension in the dark, it was the parents who were the most fearful, terrified of the ultimate loss, a pain they could never extinguish. For the previous 3 Christmases, without fail, the worst had happened. A child had went missing. While I was very young, I remember it all as though it were yesterday. The suburb where we lived had become the most somber of places. Such a tragedy can do that, slowly draining away any hope or happiness from a community like blood from an open wound. No Christmas tree nor carol sang could stem the flow. The first to disappear was Tommy.
He was 11 years old, and although I had seen him around, I didn't really know him personally. I remember my mother crying about it. Just the thought of something terrible happening to a child distressed her greatly, and the pain that the parents must have been going through was often on her lips. That Christmas, my dad held on to me tighter than he had ever done before, and I could tell that they were affected terribly by the disappearance, just as the rest of the community had been. The following year, another Christmas came and another child was taken. Her name was Cheryl, and she was only 4 years old, tiny and fragile. Tears were shed, misplaced rage vented towards the police, who were unable to find her. And by New Year, it was the commonly held view that, like Tommy the year before, little Cheryl would never be found. I, like many of my friends, had been scared by the vanishing children. It was the first time that I became aware that adults could do harm, even to the most vulnerable of us, that children were not always safe, and that those bigger and stronger than us could have unspeakable things on their minds. Yes, I had heard the fairy tales and frightening stories of the Pied Piper and the Bogeyman, but what was going on in our suburb was far more gut-wrenching, far more real than any tall tale. Despite this impact, it was not until the third child disappeared that I was truly heartbroken. His name was Finn, and he was one of my friends, a close one at that. We lived on the same street, playing football in a field by his house and walking to and from school together each day. My dad used to take us to the cinema most Sundays, buying us each a hot dog, and when we got home, Mom would serve us a beautiful Sunday roast. Finn was like part of the family, and I still think about him to this day. Where would he have been now? What would he have done with his life? How diminished have we been not knowing that boy, or the adult he would have become? No laughs, no tears together, just an empty seat in the cinema, a vacant desk in the classroom. I remember his blue eyes and blonde hair more than anything for some reason, that and his happy-go-lucky nature. I missed him then, and even now, I wish that it were not true. Like the others, Finn had been snatched from his bed as he slept on that most peaceful of nights, Christmas Eve. His parents had tucked him in, hanging his stocking over the fireplace, kissing his forehead, whispering a Merry Christmas as he fell asleep. They woke expecting to hear the excited scampering footsteps of their son rushing down the stairs to see what Santa had brought, what wrapped secret boxes he had left by the tree, and instead were confronted with an empty bed, the loss of their only child, and an open window sucking in the biting frost of Christmas Day. The parents of all three children would not let go, could not, nor would they assume the worst. Search parties were organized, flyers were continually posted through letterboxes, pasted onto bulletin boards, and shop windows across the city. And the hope was always there that somehow, somewhere, the three children would be found, unharmed and ready to come home. That year, on the 28th of November, 1965, all hope was extinguished. In an old sewage pipe across town, the crumpled, fragile bodies of Tommy, Cheryl, and dear Finn were found stuffed unceremoniously into a corroded pipe in an old sewer, rotting in the waters below. The pain was palpable, the families inconsolable, and for all of us who knew any of the victims, it was to be a bleak and shadow-ridden Christmas. 3 days later, the month turned. Eyes moved towards Christmas and the shaking fear that something cruel and callous lived amongst us all. 3 children in 3 years, now into the 4th. What would happen that Christmas Eve? Which family would be broken? Which child torn from its comfy warm bed dreaming of Santa only to be killed and discarded like a piece of fetid waste? My parents were nervous, and who could blame them? I sensed the change in atmosphere around the streets where I usually played, families pulling their children in earlier and earlier before the dark came. At night, on more than one occasion, I heard hammering echoing out from an unseen source. No doubt windows being nailed shut to prevent any more children being snatched as they slept. On the 1st of December, my dad hung our Christmas lights outside along the gutter of our roof, little beads of glowing color piercing through each cold winter night. We tried to continue on as normal and think of happier times. As always, he asked me to help. "You're my wingman, kiddo," he'd say from behind his bright red scarf, clambering up a set of wooden ladders to the roof above. He had flown for the Air Force before I was born and still used the lexicon of those days in the military, but I didn't mind. It made me feel special. In previous years, I had been too small, too young to be of any real use in decorating the outside of our home, but my dad always included me. I think he just liked to do things with me, to have some father-son time. Standing at the bottom of the ladders, looking up at him whistling Christmas songs out loud made me feel part of the accomplishment, part of the yearly celebrations. That December was different, however. It was the first time I was big enough to go up the ladders with him, to look out at the old street below and see the occasional blink from a weathered set of lights clinging to a neighbor's fence or home. My mom was terrified. She had visions of us both falling to our death, but my dad always seemed sure of himself. Not arrogant, just confident, and cheerfully reminding us all that things would be okay. Looking back, I think that's what I loved about him the most when I was a kid. The fact that he had it all in hand and did everything to reassure his family and friends. I never felt in danger up those ladders. Always loved, always safe. Always. Before we came down, I remember looking at the rooftops poking out in regimented lines from the streets around. I noticed that the world seemed different from up there, and that to me, there appeared to be fewer Christmas lights than ever before.
That night, I knew what was coming. My mom tucked me into my bed as my dad finished hanging some paper ring decorations from my bedroom ceiling. I always felt that those decorations protected me somehow. I'd stir in the night, scared the dark, and yet at Christmas time, I believed that somehow those pieces of colored paper, that blinking Christmas tree in the other room, that those symbols, those pieces of goodwill would keep whatever monstrosities hid in the dark at bay. My mom kissed me on the forehead and left the room. And there was my dad, standing in the corner with his hands behind his back, smiling. "Well, wingman, you know what time it is," he said as we both began to chuckle. "Let me see, Dad, please," I yelled, excited. From behind his back, he produced an advent calendar. I leapt for joy across the room and hugged him before snatching it from his hands and diving back under the covers. Sitting down on the bed, Dad ruffled my hair with his fingers, watching me curiously. He knew I loved getting an advent calendar each Christmas, and I'd worried that I wouldn't get one that year, as he'd told me that most of the shops were sold out of them. But Dad being Dad, he'd spent hours driving around until he found one, and made sure that on the night of December 1st, the first night of Advent, there it was. The calendar was beautiful, handmade with carefully crafted drawings on its front and back. The lines and sketch colors lovingly showed a Christmas street full of lights, with houses covered in snow and the windows beaming with a warm yellow glow waiting for the night Santa would arrive. What I loved about each year's Advent calendar, the good ones at least, was that they told a story. They showed something wonderful happening. Each door or window would be open night upon night, revealing a picture, building until that magical climax of Christmas. I loved the anticipation of the holidays, and the Advent calendar symbolized the hopes that Christmas held. Not just presents, although as a child that was a big part of it, but spending time with my family, seeing my grandparents who usually lived in another part of the country, and getting to eat all the chocolates and turkey I could cram into my mouth. Getting to be away from the boredom of school, getting to play with new toys, getting to have fun with my friends. It was the thought of friends which brought me down for a moment. There I was holding an advent calendar, each cardboard door numbered from 1 to 24, from the 1st of December until Christmas Eve, the same night that 1 year previous, my dear friend Finn had been taken, murdered, and left to rot down a sewer. I began to cry, and almost instinctively, my dad seemed to know what was upsetting me. He asked about Finn, and when he mentioned his name, I sobbed deeper than I had since his death. My poor friend who would never again go on those carefree days out with me and Dad, or walk alongside me to school, laughing and playing. It was then that my father explained to me something about death, words which have always stayed with me. You know something, kiddo? As long as you keep the memory of the people you've lost in your mind and in your heart, they'll always be alive. They'll always be with you. So Finn is right here, he said, pointing to my chest gently. With those words, I felt a soothing comfort wash over me, and all cried out, my dad tucked me into bed, kissed me on the head, and said goodnight, knowing to leave my bedroom door open slightly, to let some light from the hall keep my room from the dark. He had left the advent calendar sitting nearby, its closed windows facing me from my nightstand. And yet I was exhausted, and so my thoughts drifted from what lay behind those cardboard doors to sleep and hopefully to a more rested state of mind, but that did not occur. I woke in the night from a horrendous dream about my friend Finn. Little 4-year-old Cheryl and 11-year-old Tommy Graham crushed down a sewer pipe, the water running over their bodies into mouths which once spoke and laughed and smiled,
only then to be rendered silent by an unseen, brutal hand. In the darkness, Finn's voice cried out, garbled and drowned. A word came forth and clung to me like no other. He said, "Run." I leapt out from my bed, soaked in sweat, ready to cry out for my mom and dad, but then something strange caught my attention, shaking me to the core. I looked to the advent calendar, to the drawings of cozy houses covered in snow, their windows beaming out into the cold December night, sitting there, waiting almost as I had left it. Yet something was amiss, something which I had no memory of. The first advent door had been opened, the cardboard left ajar like the one to my room. Stepping forward, the sweat dripped from my hand as I pulled the door back to reveal what secrets the calendar had in store for me. In what little light there was, I squinted, my mind slowly piecing together the picture behind door number 1. As my eyes adjusted, I recoiled in horror at the sight and screamed for my family. Within seconds, the light was on, and my dad appeared, picking me up, consoling me as he put me back into bed. I pointed feverishly over to the calendar, telling him that something awful hid behind the door. Of course, he looked, then smiled reassuringly. "It's just a happy Christmas scene, kiddo," he said, handing it to me. Looking closely, I could see that the picture had changed slightly. It depicted an old stone bridge covered in snow, children playing on top of it happily. Yes, it appeared quite harmless, quite serene. My father left, and soon I was drifting back to sleep. Yet, my mind hazed over with two thoughts, of Finn screaming "run" in my dream, and of what I could have sworn I'd seen in that first little calendar door. The bridge was there, but underneath, in the dark, eyes looked out to the children playing gleefully above, eyes which seemed racked with rage and hate. The next day at school went quickly, but on my way home I dragged my feet over the bitter frozen concrete paths and pavements, thinking of Finn and how he had always walked with me. As my house came into view, I smiled for a moment at the lights Dad and I had hung on the roof. They warmed my spirits, but when I entered my room, my soul was chilled stagnant once more. The next advent calendar door had been opened. This time I knew I hadn't been there to do such a thing in my sleep as I had assumed must have happened the night before. No, someone had opened it. I touched the yellow number 2 of the cardboard door, a number which should have promised a treat or a happy picture, reminding me that Christmas was near. I hesitated and then looked behind it. Another street scene played out before me. This time, a small boy pulled a red sledge behind him as other children threw snowballs at each other, grinning wide and happy. At first, I sighed with relief that the picture had no hidden intruder, no eyes staring out in the darkness in contempt, but just as I sat the calendar back down to my nightstand, I saw it, the faint outline of a person looking out towards me, almost invisible yet hiding within that Christmas scene in plain view, sitting there on the boy's red sledge. I closed my eyes and rubbed them, fearful that they might reaffirm the presence once more when opened. But just as the darkened eyes had disappeared from under the bridge on the 1st of December, the faint outline of the unseen pretender had moved on from the picture. I knew that no one would believe me, and even worse, I barely believed it myself. My 9-year-old mind could not comprehend such strange and ominous occurrences, yet I was not so removed from the idea of horrid things scuttling around in the dark, creatures which even parents could not protect you from. The figure had moved on, I was certain of it, and I knew that it must have traveled and hid behind the door for the 3rd of December. The next morning, I told myself that I would not open any of the closed doors from the advent calendar. I promised myself, but something was doing it for me. That night, I awoke in the darkness once more, the same dream playing out, poor Finn muffled and drowned by the putrid sewage water, crying out in the dark, crying out and yet warning, pleading. He said, "Run, run." Again, I leapt from my bed, and once more the calendar door for that day had been opened by an unseen force. There in the dark, I looked, compelled by the fear of not looking, the terror of not knowing what to come. For in that third picture, it became clear to me something was on its way. Something unspeakable it was plotting, and slowly but surely drawing closer. Behind that door lay another Christmas scene, family skating on a beautiful iced lake, and under that transparent barrier between the cold air and the icy water was a shape, darkened and definite, but malevolent, a blurred form under the ice, eyes staring up and disgusted the families who happily skated above. I screamed again, and yet the results were all too familiar. My mom and dad arrived tired, yet never annoyed at their child for waking them in the night. Mom put me into bed, and as she did so, I explained frantically to them both that something was appearing in the advent calendar, that each door held proof of something that meant to do me harm, but there was no evidence of it, only 3 open doors showing happiness and fun at Christmas. Dad said I was having bad dreams and that he and Mom would sit with me for a while until I fell asleep. I heard them whispering about work in the morning, but they were more concerned about me than losing a few hours of rest. The next day, again, I tried to ignore the advent calendar, tried desperately to avoid its doors, and again, I failed. In the night, I awoke from the same hideous dream, and yet this time, the calendar was not open. The door with the yellow number 4 remained closed. I hoped that whatever strange thing was in those pictures had left, that I could forget the hateful haunting eyes, and that I could return to simply enjoying the anticipation of Christmas. But just as I nodded back to sleep, happier than I had been since they had first found Finn's body, I heard something, the sound of a thumb or finger pulling at cardboard. I opened my eyes and stared in utter disbelief as the 4th door was pulled open by an invisible hand in the dark. It is strange that I did not scream, but since then I have heard people say that when you are as scared as you can possibly be, that you cannot move, nor can you cry out for help. I opened my mouth and no noise came, a paralysis of fear that was overpowering. There I lay in the night, staring wide-eyed at the 4th door, wondering what disturbing depiction it would reveal, and even more so terrified that whatever had opened it still lurked nearby. I wish I could say that it stopped, that the horrid revelation ceased, but I cannot. Some nights the dreams of Finn yelling at me to run came, but on others they did not. The only constant was that at some point a calendar door would be opened, whether in the morning or at night. Each door would show a happy scene, and each time something hideous, which only I could see, would be momentarily present. One door showed a group of carolers cheerfully sealing at night, warmed by the glow of an open window, and at the rear there stood an outline, something watching, something waiting, something moving on relentlessly to Christmas Eve, the last door. Another picture showed a small girl, no older than poor Cheryl, who had been killed, placing presents into a stocking, and yet for a moment there was the faintest impression of a hand reaching out from the stocking towards the girl. By the 20th, the horrific pictures had intensified, as two had the dreams. Finn now screamed my name, his voice echoing up through a drain, pleading with me to get away. And as those nightly terrors revealed themselves, the pictures had taken on more weight, more immediacy, for I was certain that they now showed the street where I lived. My dad found me crying that night, and when asked what was wrong, I told him. I believed that there was something evil coming, something horrendous that had snatched a child each of the previous 3 Christmas Eves, the same evil that had taken my friend, that hidden horror which on Christmas Eve would come for me. Dad reassured me that this was not the case, that I was imagining things. When he looked at the pictures on the calendar, he just saw nondescript streets, anonymous faces, nothing that suggested the place where we lived. But I saw differently. The drawings clearly showed, house by house, inch by inch, that something was drawing nearer each day, fleeting glimpses of a faint figure waiting to gorge itself once more. My dad offered to throw away the advent calendar if it was upsetting me so much, but I pleaded with him not to. I needed to know. I had to see what was coming, what was on its way to snatch me from my family as it had done the other children. The 21st, 22nd, and 23rd of December were torturous. While I should have been excited for Christmas Day, I was not. I was terrified, for I knew that I would never live to see it. The calendar door on the 21st, opened by something unseen while I slept, showed a house come into view, one with glowing lights hung around the roof, and the faint outline of something terrible approaching nearby. I was certain that the house was mine, and that the light that beamed outward into the snowy landscape was from my family. Though, as I peered out into the night from my window, there was no snow in reality, just a biting wind and a frost that covered everything like a shroud. I could not see a figure out there, but I felt it, somewhere close, just waiting for Christmas Eve. On the 22nd, the figure drew closer to our home as the snow fell around it in the advent calendar, and on the 23rd, the prowler had reached the gate to our garden. That night I had such a terrible vision. In my dream, I found myself lying in the dark. I could not see, and all that surrounded me was the empty coldness of winter. Pain coursed through my body, and the sound of running water pushed over it, forcing me deeper into an abandoned drain. Putting out my hand instinctively, my fingers touched the frozen mouth of another child. Slowly it moved against my hand, and its stagnant lips whispered as if weakened, "Run, get away." I did not wake screaming, nor did I leap from my bed like the other nights like an animal fleeing from a predator. There I lay in the silence of the night, and in that stillness, I cried. The paper chains and decorations my family had hung from my room ceiling proved no protection from the pain or from the thoughts of the 3 children, how they had been taken, and how I would be next. And then the day had come. Christmas Eve, I was frightened, but a distance took me, one that slowed my words and left me dispassionate about the festive season, about my family. I wish I had not been that way and had savored every moment I had left, but I was drained, numbed by the lurking fear that had haunted me for weeks, tired of it all, a strain that no 9-year-old should have to have been bare. My dad knew that I wasn't my usual self, as I normally relished Christmas Eve like most children, excited and completely enthused for what would come, but there I was outside in the cold, helping him fix part of the lights that had been unhooked in the wind. I watched my dad on the ladders once more, the wind rattling everything around, the slates on the roof, the trees, the gutter. I thought about how Finn's family, or little Cheryl's, or even Tommy Graham's would have been preparing for Christmas Day like we were, happily unaware of the loss they were about to undergo. At least I knew. I had foresight, each hideous picture hinting at that faint figure coming closer and closer to my home, to open my window as I slept waiting for Christmas morning, to snatch me from my bed, to slaughter me, discarding my body down a sewer pipe, used and forgotten. As the wind howled and the lights chinked and jingled together, I looked back at the gate to our garden, to where I had last seen my future attacker. I could see nothing. Just an empty street on the quietest night of the year, but in that absence, I could feel eyes bearing into me. My dad climbed down the ladder, whistling merrily to himself, and as I looked up at him, I simply asked, matter-of-factly, if he would nail my window shut. He didn't ask why. He knew many parents had done the same, and so we went inside as the evening rolled in, carried by the promise of frost from the outskirts of the city. Dad got his toolbox out and drove a large series of nails into the frame of the window. Once I was confident that there was no way to open it, I thanked him and asked if he would do one more thing for me. Only one. To sit next to my bed all night and look over me until morning. Unlike the other nights, he did not tell me that there was no monstrosity out there, nor did he say that the world was a safe place, for that would have been a lie. He placed his hand gently on my shoulder and said, "If you need me, I'll sit right here until it's time to open the presents."
And sit there he did. My mother came in to kiss me on the head before returning back to the kitchen where she was preparing things for the dinner next day. I so wanted to see it. Presents meant nothing to me by that night. All I cared about was being there at the family table, laughing with Gramps and Gran, and knowing that the nightmare of December 1965 was over. I fell asleep as my dad sat by the bed reading his book. It must have been 2 or 3 in the morning when I woke. I was unsure of the precise time, but what I knew was that my dad was standing at my window looking down, out to the street below. I whispered to him and asked what was wrong, but his reply was hesitant. "Nothing, kiddo. Go back to sleep." Then I heard it, certain and labored. The sound of footsteps slowly walking up our garden path outside, shambling forward towards our home. The sound frightened me, and my thoughts immediately turned to the Advent calendar, to the faint outline figure which had haunted me. From what little light there was, I could see that the door for Christmas Eve was sealed shut, yet to be opened. The footsteps continued, one after the other, slowly, steadily. My dad stared intently outside as I asked if he could see anyone there, but he just shook his head in disbelief. The footsteps ceased and silence covered everything like the frost outside. Suddenly, it was broken by 3 loud booming knocks. It was at our door. I cried out in terror and started sobbing. "It's come to take me, Dad, like Finn and the others!" I howled in utter despair as the tears slid down my cheek. "Nonsense, it must just be a neighbor or something," my dad said unconvincingly. "No, Dad, it's here to take me away," I screamed as I handed the calendar to him. "Open the last door, open it and you'll see it. Christmas Eve, each Christmas Eve it takes a child, and if you open that you'll see it, I promise you'll see it." 3 more loud knocks echoed out, and for the first time in my life, I saw fear flicker across my dad's face as I could hear my mom stirring from her room, shouting through asking what was going on. 3 knocks once more, this time more pronounced. "Please, Dad, look at the door, open it, and you'll believe me, it's here for me." My father's hand trembled as it held the calendar tightly. Slowly, he opened the last door to see what was shown. "God, no," he yelled out, and with that, we heard the most hideous of sounds, one which was laced with dread. A click of a lock, the turning of a handle, and the front door opening to the cold. Then footsteps climbing stairs, looking, seeking, and then slowly coming down the hall towards my room. "Dad, please help me," I pleaded as the nightmarish thing in our house drew closer. He looked at me, trying his best to hide his fear, but I could see it etched into his face, into his soul. "Listen to me, son. As soon as I go out there, I need you to grab all your things, anything heavy, and barricade your door. Don't let anyone in this room unless it's me or your mother." I believe in that moment he saw the utter despair in my eyes, and before he left the room, as the footsteps reached the room next to mine, he spoke gently, patting me on the head. "It'll be okay," he said. Then he was gone.
I did as he said, and as soon as he had left the room, I moved my nightstand, my chair, my books, anything I could against the door, sobbing my eyes out, praying that my parents were safe. At first, I heard nothing throughout our house. Then suddenly violent shouting erupted, a struggle quickly followed with what sounded like furniture being thrown and glass smashed, and then the worst of it, my mother screaming. She cried and yelled and agonized. And finally, I could not bear it anymore. I could not leave her alone. Clearing the things away from my door, I opened it and wandered down the darkened hall. A cold, icy air blew through the house. The front door lay open, decorations swung in the frozen breeze, and outside knelt my mother, alone, terrified, screaming into the night. Losing a parent is hard for a child, and to do so on Christmas Eve, harder still. Yet the torture of that night cuts deeper than most. Few can know my true pain. Over the years, I've tried to understand it more clearly, understand what my life was before and what it is now. To little avail. I cannot give solid explanations, nor can I say that my anger will ever truly diminish. I've tried to live as best I can, putting the mystery out of my mind each year that is, until Christmas, when the memories flood back like a comforting blanket, soon torn away by a silent hand from the dark. My own children, now grown up, have asked me why I become a little distant at this time of year, and to that I've given no real answer. All I can say is this: I do know two things, both of which haunt me to this day. The first is that no one ever saw or heard from my dad. My mother remained tight-lipped until she died about what came into our house that night, what took her husband, and who can blame her? I also know what the last door of the Advent calendar contained, and what had frightened my dad so badly. It was a drawing like the others, a happy Christmas scene, with one horrid addition. It showed a boy sleeping soundly in his bed on Christmas Eve, a child who looked uncannily like my poor friend Finn, unaware that his life would soon be over and that he was being watched through the frosted window by his killer, whose face looked remarkably like that of my father's.
A Christmas feast. He first suspected that they were going to eat him when he noticed the distinct lack of Yuletide smells. It wasn't perhaps a conscious thought, at least not one which had been fully realized, but there was a clear growing uneasiness within him. Somehow, he just knew. Surely, if a family invited you for Christmas dinner, the house would be filled with the wonderful aromas associated with that annual feast. Succulent roast turkey, honey-glazed vegetables, perhaps the fumes of mulled wine or a brandy-covered Christmas pudding. But no, all of these were absent. Yet the table was set. It was a particularly bleak Christmas, and while snow was often welcome at that festive time of the year, the penetrating cold and frost, which seemed to sabotage both homes and their residents' bodies, was not. The temperature had plummeted on the 7th, and there had been little sign of any forthcoming reprieve. Families attempted as best they could to reach one another, but for many it was to be a lonely Christmas day. Travel, especially for the elderly, was almost impossible for fear of slipping on the ice. One fall was all it would take for a broken hip or shoulder, and for the more fragile individuals amongst them, recovering from such an injury was not an easy task, certainly not as easy as it would be for those of a younger vintage. The Cardinal family had taken pity on an elderly gentleman who had recently moved into the neighborhood only a few streets away. They were of an upstanding stock and took part in a local home help initiative, spending time with the old and vulnerable. Everyone knew and loved them. Timmy was the youngest, a boy of only 5 or 6. He was a child whom all looked upon with great adoration, never complaining, never causing trouble, always adorable, and his 10-year-old sister, Camilla, was equally as admired. They were both a testament to the caring and nurturing parenting skills of Ben and Lucy Cardinal. Each year, as the cold winter drew in, the Cardinal family were admired for their dedication and commitment to those around them, their passion, almost zeal, for helping those who were less fortunate. But behind the smiles and the skin-deep facade of that of a loving family lurked a far more sinister purpose. They had a tradition each year, a way to reward themselves for their kindness and generosity, one which stemmed back through many previous generations of the Cardinal family. Each Christmas, they would invite a guest for dinner who would be welcomed with open arms into their home, sat down at a beautifully set table, provided with humorous and enjoyable Christmas conversation, and then by the light of the roaring fire, the guest would be stabbed to death and eaten gratefully. They all reveled in the old tradition, with Timmy looking forward to it the most. He had a ferocious appetite and a waistline to match it. But children do get so wrapped up in the anticipation of a family Christmas, and his parents were delighted to see a growing boy fill his belly. Camilla was of more quiet disposition than her stout little brother, slight of figure with a pallid complexion which reminded all of her mother, but make no mistake, she adored eating with the family and could render anyone silent with a sharp, cold insult. Ben was a local police chief for the area, so covering up their annual feast was quite the cinch, while Lucy was, shall we say, a relation of sorts, and was entirely enthusiastic about maintaining the Christmas tradition. Their guests were invariably those without family, and often of a ripe old age, forgotten by society, left to wither in their isolated little houses. Ben explained to the children yearly that it was almost a kindness to put the victims out of their slowly increasing misery. And besides, when they did eventually die, they would be shoved into a box in the ground or roasted into ashes. What a waste of good meat! This year, Timmy and Camilla were especially excited. It was all their mother could do to calm their nerves, but on that Christmas Eve, it was nearly impossible, for they knew the special treat they were in for the following day. The Cardinals were hosting a most special guest. His name was Sergio Marrero, and he hailed from Eastern Europe. They had never had foreign meat before, and the very idea of tearing into some delicious exotic muscle and fat made this year's feast something to really look forward to. They had met Old Man Marrero just a few weeks earlier when Ben had noticed the unusual name on his home help list. Each year as Christmas approached, the volunteers at the local church would be given names and addresses of pensioners in the area who had no family and would be quite alone over the holiday season. At that festive time of year, and worried that many of the frailer residents might succumb to the biting cold, church committee members would visit each of these lonely individuals and offer a friendly ear, a helping hand, and often some hearty food to the poorest of those on the list. The names would rarely change, but at least one person on that list would sadly pass away that year. Being an upstanding member of the community and a high-ranking police officer in the area, Ben would often inform the church that one of their flock had sadly passed away, and with no friends or family known, he would concoct a lie which usually involved a long-lost son or daughter appearing to take their sadly departed parent somewhere far away to be buried. That, or he would say that they had simply moved, having a bit of a deal with a local estate agent and solicitor's firm to throw the proceeds from any property sales their way. The family were not without influence. It was incredible how little people questioned this, but as the Cardinals ensured that each Christmas meal was not an active member in the church or community, people just assumed that Ben knew best. This year, the Cardinals had been hoping to invite Lucy Ridgely around for her Christmas swan song, but unfortunately, she had died in the summer. Ben had investigated, and he suspected that an intruder had been inside the house with her at the time of her death, but it seemed as though the causes were natural. No, the family would just have to have someone different for dinner. Then the name appeared on the list. Sergio Marrero, 86, slight emphysema, no family. Knows no one in the area as he has only recently moved here. Perfect. Ben found Mr. Marrero to be an absolute delight. While he was obviously very frail, his mind was still sharp, and regaled Ben with numerous colorful stories about the old country and the adventures he had while in the full bloom of youth. Of particular interest were his war stories, and Ben was thrilled to know that their main course was that of an intelligent, well-traveled man. He even looked unlike any of the previous victims. He was quite tall, although slightly hunched with age, and with a long crooked nose and intense stare, Ben fancied that in his youth Marrero would have been quite intimidating. His kind smile and obvious fragile frame, however, left Ben in no doubt that the kids would love him. They enjoyed eating those with character and a gentle disposition. He always enjoyed the meat more if it had a keen mind and was out of the ordinary, as the family religion, one that had managed to stay unseen yet influential throughout the centuries, stated that the eating of another human being would transmit some of its strengths to those whom devoured it. As with many of those who can only look into the past rather than into the future, Sergio Marrero enjoyed the company greatly and was touched when Ben invited him to sit at his family's Christmas table. The old man was extremely frail and required the assistance of both Ben and Camilla to help him in and out of Ben's car and then into the house. His emphysema was particularly bad that day, as each step was accompanied by the wheezing, fluid-filled sounds of struggling lungs. Each room of the Cardinal home was draped in a multicolored selection of rather crass Christmas decorations, with numerous cards adorning every visible table and mantelpiece, showcasing just how popular Ben and his family really were.
The table was beautifully laid with a red cotton cloth resting underneath an elegant creme dining set. The old man found that the rest of Ben's family were just as pleasant and congenial as he was. Timmy and Camilla were kind and very well behaved for their age, helping the frail old man to his chair carefully and then waiting on him, topping up his drink as their mother and father busied themselves in the kitchen. Finally, Lucy appeared carrying the huge centerpiece plate. It was unusually large, and as she sat it in the middle of the table, empty and devoid of food, Old Man Marrero caught a look on Lucy's face. It was brief, and he immediately politely attempted to disregard it as a product of his imagination, but it unsettled him deeply. It was as if a private joke had passed between the eyes of Lucy and her children, a flicker of a grin, and not one of kindness or of Christmas spirit, but rather one resembling that of a conspiratorial bully, as if Sergio was the unwitting recipient of some unwholesome prank, waiting to be ridiculed. Just as the unease began to diminish, Ben appeared with a large, jagged carving knife and a long, two-pronged fork which reminded Sergio more of a butcher's implement than that required to cut a decent-sized turkey, a turkey which became increasingly conspicuous by its absence. There they sat for over an hour, each member of the cardinal family replenishing the old man's drink with enthusiasm and showing concern for every and each cough or moment of uncomfortable breathing experienced by their guest. But it was a strange concern. There they sat gleefully asking Sergio questions and then listening to the stories and answers which came about his life, where he had lived, how many battles he had fought in, but the interest and concern seemed to be distant somehow. It was only skin deep. Each time their guests mentioned the old country, those same conspiracy-laden glances were traded across the table as if excited, not by the content of the stories, but rather by the simple fact that Mirari was a foreigner. The absence of not only food, but that of the mere mention of it was unsettling enough, but what was more perplexing was that Ben repeatedly stole looks towards an antique clock that sat on a mantelpiece above the fire, looks which were poorly hidden and betrayed their purpose. He was counting down the minutes to some event. While the old man had no idea what that event was, the certainty was apparent that it was not connected to anything cooking in the kitchen oven. Miraro knew that there was simply no food being roasted, grilled, or even cooled on a window ledge nearby. Whatever was being planned, it was not going to involve him eating a Christmas meal. It was Camilla who stopped smiling first at his anecdotes and historical observations. She had ceased listening. No longer was she politely laughing at obvious jokes and the endearing sight of an old man repeating himself through forgetfulness. Camilla was simply staring with those pinpoint, cold, dark eyes, as a snake before a strike. Timmy was next to abandon the act as he began to grin menacingly at Sergio as his hands gripped a small serrated steak knife intensely. The most alarming thing was that the focus of Timmy's stare was not the old man's face, but his wrinkled neck. With one last glance at the clock, Ben ceased being the jovial, attentive host and began to run his fingers along the huge carving knife in front of him with a mixture of anger and lust upon his face. Sergio had seen many things in his time, but nothing as surprisingly strange and unnerving as this. Finally, when the clock began to chime, Lucy relinquished her false, endearing shell and exposed the cold-hearted and twisted personality which lay beneath. As the chimes slowly rang throughout the house, one by one, echoing and lonely and piercing in their symbolism, each of the cardinals rose up from their chairs, sharp, jagged knives in hand, and waited. The chime rang once, and they uttered an indecipherable phrase in unison. The chime rang twice, and they increased their cult-like chorus in ferocity and volume. The chime rang 3 times, and then they stopped. All were silent, the house devoid of sound, Christmas spirit, and that of hope. The old man's wheezing crew and intensity as the uniquely bizarre sight of the twisted family about to dine dawned on Sergio. The family then quietly and efficiently walked around the dining table and stood motionless, surrounding their guest. Just as the old man was about to inquire what was to become of him, the clock on the mantelpiece burst into life one final time. The time was different from the others. It was sharper, somehow fouler, and echoed once and once only throughout the cardinal home. From behind, Lucy slit the old man's throat from ear to ear as Ben thrust his carving knife deep into Sergio's stomach. Both parents then removed their knives and stood back watching with pride as Camilla cut and stabbed repeatedly while Timmy thrust his steak knife in and out of Marara's legs, neck, and arms. After a few minutes, the frenzy diminished as both children grew tired, and with one last downward thrust, Timmy drove his steak knife so deeply into the old man's hand that it skewered it completely, embedding itself into the table on which the hand rested. The children now ran to their parents' collective embrace. They hugged and rejoiced in what was a fantastic Christmas game, and now could look forward to delight to some succulent exotic meat. Arms wrapped around one another, they stared at their victim and began to laugh loudly, commenting on the old fool stories of times gone by, the war, and the old country. As they turned to each other once more, the laughter diminished, and they looked into each other's rosy, blood-covered faces and shared a family moment. This had been one of Ben's favorite sacrifices. But the laughter had not completely ceased. One person was still laughing loudly. Confusion turned to abject horror as the bizarre truth revealed itself. He was Mr. Mararo. Sitting covered in blood, his head tilted back and the deep cut in his throat wide open, the dinner guest laughed loud and strong, a laugh that was both young and old. His head arched forward as he pulled Timmy's steak knife out of his hand, dropping it on the floor. Camilla screamed as Lucy hid behind Ben. What they thought to be a corpse now stared at them all as they had stared at it with a singular purpose. Timmy began to pee himself and cry as 2 previously retracted fangs cracked through the old man's upper gum, revealing a serrated and terrifying grin. As he rose to his feet, Lucy fainted, and with both hunch and age now gone, the cardinal's guest loomed tall and dark before them, his eyes piercing, telling tales of countries and of decades and of centuries of existence. Sergio Mararo ate well that Christmas. The end. Staring at the tree, whiskey in hand, Pete was pleased that this year would be different from the last. It had been the strangest time of his life, but he truly felt like things were finally coming together, and when better to come together than at Christmas, a time he loved more than any other. In some ways, the past year had been like an eternity, in others, as if it had succumbed to time in the blink of an eye, but either way, he was glad to see the back of it. Staring at the Christmas tree, its beautiful lights casting a warm hue over the room, and the snow quietly falling outside as the sun set, Pete began to think of the past year, of his daughter, Lana, and his wife, Janet. It had started with a very normal December. 12 months earlier, the small town in which they lived was covered in a thick layer of snow, the residents spending most of their days clearing driveways, and Pete's wife going off for one of her usual wanders. She'd been gone for a couple of hours, but while Janet was utterly devoted to her family, she still needed moments to herself, to clear her head, to diminish the stress that comes with a loving, yet disorganized husband and a little girl who was kind, but whom enjoyed trying her parents' patience as much as possible. When the tensions of a domestic life clouded her feelings or began to weigh on her spirits, Janet would wander out of the back door into the fields and woodlands which characterized the entire area and trek for a little while through the pines which dotted the landscape. It therefore wasn't unusual for her to be gone for fairly long periods, especially since it was around that time of year when she would take it upon herself to choose the Christmas tree. No matter how much Pete or Lana asked to help out, this was Janet's job. She loved the tradition of it, the process of choosing the best possible tree, cutting it down, bringing it home on a small sledge, and then seeing the bright smiles on her family's faces as they would gleefully take the tree indoors and decorate it with sparkling glitter garlands, warm glowing lights, and an array of festive baubles. It was a small highland town where they lived, far away from any major city, but Janet and the rest of her family loved their home. The simplicity of it, the feeling of being an integral part of a close-knit community, and of course the beautiful surroundings, lush during the Scottish summer, and cold, crisp, stark, but yet awe-inspiring in the winter. Most importantly, she loved the pine woods nearby, specifically a collection of trees which sat at the top of a small hill within walking distance from the house, perfect for picking a Christmas tree. She would return there each year, and while their numbers thinned due to a few other neighbors going there for the exact same purpose, there were enough trees to last a good many years. When she had been gone for 3 hours, Pete began to grow nervous, as this was longer than usual, and since it was getting dark, he took it upon himself to venture outside, telling Lana to lock the doors after him and that he would not be long. Lana laughed when he told her that he expected that Mummy was struggling through the snow with a huge tree, bigger than any other they had ever had. Pete loved to see the excitement in his daughter's face at this time of year, and he told her to watch from her bedroom window to see what they would bring back. With this, she excitedly ran up the stairs straight to her window before he had to call her back down to lock the door. Gazing at the beautiful tree, he could remember that night like it was yesterday. The snow was crisp on the ground and crunched under his feet as it began to freeze. Small flakes fell from the sky occasionally, but Janet's footprints remained uncovered. Even without them, Pete knew where they were heading. The hill where Janet returned each year was only a 40-minute hike away. She would pick a pine tree from there. In fact, sometimes she picked two. One around 6 foot, the other a young tree about half the size if they could find one suitable. It was difficult at times to find smaller trees as they seemed to be rare in that area. Everyone in the town seemed to like the idea of having a small tree in their children's bedrooms, so people would climb up there with an axe and take what they wanted so there weren't as many at hand. Lana at one time thought it was sad to cut down and kill the trees just for people to look at, but Pete explained to her about tradition and that he was sure more would grow back. With time, she forgot this protest and looked forward to the years when she could have one. If a smaller tree couldn't be found, they had a lovely synthetic one which would sit at her window. Secretly, she loved this just as much, but as her father had said, tradition is tradition. The larger tree would be placed in the living room and adorned with an assortment of baubles, glittering decorations, and lights. The other, in Lana's room, would be sprayed with a can of fake snow and covered in hanging candy sticks and chocolates, although she was always told she could only have one a day before bed as a treat. Of course, occasionally she would break this rule and just hope no one would notice. Janet could always tell, but she would let it go. Christmas time was the best of times after all, and it was so brief. As Pete approached the hill, he knew something was wrong. He felt it in his bones. As he climbed, the snow began to fall in greater volume, and the sky dimmed with it. Standing at the humble summit, a stillness spread, silence interrupted momentarily by the almost audible patter of snowflakes floating gently to the ground. He followed the footprints now with purpose, knowing that if the snowfall increased, that it would be nearly impossible to find Janet.
Twilight fell, covering everything in a dark blue wisp of color as the frost began to nip at his now rosy cheeks. The footprints bobbed and weaved their way through the huge pines, finally stopping next to a wonderfully thick and vibrant tree, one which was perfectly suited for our purposes. The perfect size, almost 7 feet tall, a deep, life-filled green, and a thick abundance of branches and pines which made it almost impossible to visually penetrate its cover in such a light. But yet Janet was nowhere to be seen, and as far as Pete could tell, there were no other tracks in the snow leading in any direction. She most certainly had been here, but where had she gone? This was both puzzling and worrying. It seemed impossible, but there they were, Janet's last 2 footprints engraved in the ground, but the snow all around, virgin, undisturbed, and lacking all signs of life, as if she had just vanished into the night. Looking at the base of the tree, Pete ran his fingers over a deep gash in its trunk. There was no doubt about it. Janet had taken a few swipes at it with her axe. Then, for some unknown reason, she had left, or perhaps moved on to a tree she felt was more suitable. Surely not, though. This tree was perfect. So that must have been it, though. She must have moved on. Perhaps there was some random, freakish flurry of snow that covered her tracks. Yes, that must have been it, but Pete knew this was wishful thinking. He had lived there for years, and in all that time, he had never seen such a thing. Then he saw it. Several meters away, lying in the snow, was Janet's axe. He rushed to the object, falling once as the snow deepened. Rising to his feet, it was now unmistakable. Yes, it was partially covered in snow, but it was Janet's axe, all right. It lay there much like the footprints, isolated but with the absence of any human imprints, as if the tool had been dropped from a great height, but Pete did not care to speculate. A sense of growing worry permeated his mind as the thought of Janet lying somewhere injured increased his anxiety. Shouting his wife's name repeatedly drew no reply, as darkness now began to creep ever closer. If she was hurt, he would have to raise the alarm and get the town looking for her along with mountain rescue. She wouldn't survive long in the snow in that biting cold. At this thought, the panic grew. Worry, fear, hurt that can only be felt through love. With torch in hand, he continued in the direction the axe had taken him. As he entered a thick den of pine trees, he noticed the broken branches littered on the ground as if something had rushed past, tearing them apart and breaking them off on impact. Maybe Janet ran through here. The scale of the damage, however, looked too great to have been dealt by one person alone. Had he been in any other country, he would have assumed a bear was nearby, but they had been hunted to extinction in Scotland long ago, along with the wolves and any other predators. For a moment, his torch reflected off of something scuttling under a bush, but it looked more like an insect than anything else, and again, far too small to cause such devastation. Pete fixed his scarf, trying to cover his face as the frost bit deeper, but just as he did so, something caught his eye. Something on the ground. Shining his torch on what he first thought to be a dead animal was the crumpled body of Janet, lying still on the ground. A heart attack, they said. A heart attack. But Pete had seen her face. He had looked upon those eyes once so filled with kindness, transfixed in a frozen stare, cold, glassy, blackened with fear. His hands were clenched in front of him, and the pathologist told him that this was perfectly normal for one suffering such a massive heart attack in such low temperatures, as was the contorted look on her face, although at the mention of this, Pete saw a flicker in the pathologist's eyes that gave away that he was as puzzled by that look as anyone, a look Pete would never forget. Darling Janet, love of his life, mother of his children, dying alone in the cold with lips pulled back over teeth in agony, frozen into an inhuman sneer. The whole ordeal had devastated him. If it hadn't been for their daughter Lana for the necessity of her needs to be met before his own, Pete would have found it nearly impossible to have gotten through it.
The past 12 months had been cluttered with reminders of an aching loss. As with any bereavement, the first time of doing something once shared without that person made the pain more acute. The first Christmas, the first day at work, the first walk to school, the first family get-together, every person's face etched and concerned, accompanied by the usual well-meaning but empty traditions of how are you holding up? It must have been so difficult, and if there's anything I can do. Helping his daughter through the loss of her mother was all he had to make sure he could face another day. But that stopped now. They had been through the horror, through the denial, through the silent meals, through the lonely cries of despair at night, through the birthdays empty and somber. They had been through it all. All these firsts were over. It had been over 12 months since Janet's death, and Pete felt almost exhilarated by this. He still missed her every day. The pain would never truly leave him, but the feeling of accomplishment, of strength, something which he thought had deserted him, that he had endured, filled him for the first time with thoughts of the future.
thoughts that life does indeed go on, even when our dearest have gone before us. And what of his beautiful daughter? Dear, kind Lana. He may have been compelled to bring her through the past year, but her empathy and strength had left him in awe, characteristics which someone so young had no right to possess, but which were thankfully present nonetheless. When she had cried, he had been there, and on more than one occasion when he lay sobbing, staring at that empty void of space in his double bed at night, Lana would waken and climb in beside him, and they would both cry together until they fell asleep. She was his rock, and by God, she was going to have the best Christmas she'd ever had. Pete had made a number of arrangements. He had spent a fortune on every gift imaginable. He had filled the house with every food and treat that she enjoyed, and both Janet's parents and his own were flying in for Christmas dinner to be with their brave, sweet little granddaughter. He'd also organized for Lana's friends to have a sleepover on Boxing Day, which she had pleaded for, but Pete always knew he would give in eventually. She never asked for much, but this year, this Christmas, she would have more than she could imagine. The house was perfect, but there was one thing left to do, one thing that Pete had dreamt of since the night he found Janet's body. She had chosen that tree. It was going to be sitting in their living room, adorned with all manner of decorations. That was its purpose, its very reason for being. Janet never finished cutting the damn thing down. It was, in many ways, her dying act, and Pete was going to make sure that it was fulfilled. On the anniversary of her death, he wandered through the snow, winding his way through the pines until he stood at the foot of that ominous little hill. The sun shone brightly, and it wasn't as cold as it had been the night Janet died, but each footstep was accompanied by a sickness in the pit of Pete's stomach. Each stride a morbid reminder of the previous year and that terrible heartbreak in the snow. Marching to its peak, he first walked to and observed the scene of Janet's untimely death. Standing there where her body had laid, Pete wiped the tears from his eyes and placed a small Santa figurine on the ground, burying it in the snow. It had always been hung from the branches of each yearly tree and was her favorite decoration. It seemed only right that it be with her.
After another few minutes of trudging, there it was. It was still standing. That damned tree. As if ravenous for revenge, Pete pulled Janet's axe from his backpack and charged at the pine. He battered and chopped at the cut which Janet had made the previous year, making it deeper with every slice, with every pound of pressure he could muster. The tree groaned and creaked as if in pain, but Pete did not care. This tree was the final reminder of Janet's death. Whatever had happened that night, it happened because of that tree. As crazy as it seemed, it all made sense for a moment, and then clarity was clouded by mundane reality. She had simply died of natural causes. With the roar of cracked wood breaking under its own weight, the tree swooned and collapsed to the ground in defeat. Tying a rope around its trunk and then using string to fold its branches inward, Pete dragged that memory, that cold-hearted pillar of nature's brutality, through the snow, over grass and gravel, and finally to his back door. He was victorious. With little thought for carpet or furniture, he dragged it up the stairs into the house and placed it in front of the window in the living room, wedging it upright into an old wooden stump they had used as a stand every year. Breathless and covered in sweat, he stood back looking at the tree standing tall over all it surveyed. "You picked a good one, love. You picked a good one." He held back the tears and waited for Lana to return home from her friends. Pete put an old Christmas film on the television as they both decorated the tree together, singing, laughing, and being a family. There were moments, fleeting glances, when they caught one another's stare. A glance which showed pain buried deep down inside. One which said, "I miss her too." But it was Christmas, and the moments of grief passed, buffered by longer, caring periods of happiness. Contentment caressed smiles from ear to ear, and festive spirit once more filled that home which had for too long been host to loss and anguish. As night began to fall, after Lana went to bed earlier than usual because the excitement had worn her out, Pete decided to reward himself for the day's efforts. The lights were dimmed, and after pouring himself a large whiskey, he sat on the living room couch and stared at the tree. Draped in tinsel garlands and adorned with bright white Christmas lights, it really was a sight to behold. The best tree they had ever had. "Here's to you, gorgeous," Pete said, lifting his drink to the sky in a symbolic gesture. Staring at the Christmas tree, its beautiful lights casting a warm hue over the room, and the snow quietly falling outside as the sun set, Pete began to think of the past year, of his daughter Lana and his wife Janet. Time passed slowly as he thought of all things gone, how they had led to this moment through pain and suffering, but now hopefully onwards to the future, and one filled with at least the briefest possibility of joy. The glow from the tree reflected off of the window, but it penetrated far enough to illuminate the now thick blur of snow falling silently to the ground outside. The room remained dark, but the lights bathed everything subtly in a warm Yuletide radiance, which when accompanied by the orange lambency of the fire only served to cultivate the anticipation for Christmas even more so. For the first time in a year, Pete was happy. Something bothered him, though. There was a slight apprehension or annoyance at the back of his mind, something which was spoiling the display. Sipping at his whiskey, casting a glance at the entire room, he finally saw what the problem was. 2 of the Christmas tree lights were occasionally flickering. Not constantly, but often enough to be noticeable and, more importantly, aggravating. Downing the rest of his drink, Pete rose to his feet, now feeling the aches in his muscles from the effort exerted while dragging that thing all the way home from the hill. Walking over to the tree, the lights were indeed flickering, but there was something unusual about them. They seemed deeper than the rest, as if coming from around the trunk rather than resting on the branches. Again, Pete was struck by how dark the interior of the tree was, that even in the presence of many lights placed upon it, he could not peer or adequately see between the branches. Even the 2 lights which sat deeper behind the pines did not seem to illuminate their surroundings in any way. The empty glass flipped from his fingers, smashing on the floor. The lights were fine. They were not flickering at all. But the occasional blinking of 2 eyes amongst the branches had been enough to catch his attention. He froze to the spot, and it was as if the room grew somehow darker. Something stirred between the pines, between the knotted wood and the scratched porous surface. Something lived there. A feeling of utter paralysis now took hold as his feet firmly glued to the ground as the 2 eyes slowly pushed forward. Creaking and cracking, a face revealed itself from between the pine-covered branches, as if seeping out from its innermost visceral point. Mold-covered, ancient, its features twisted in rage. Fear began to course through Pete's veins. His heart beat faster and faster as the face moved closer, its eyes devoid of pupils now swamped in a maddening yellow, and from below, the protrusion of 2 thin, moss-covered legs arching out from between the branches. With a creak and snap, it straightened itself, now standing in all of its terrible glory in front of the tree. It was now pitch black outside, and it would have been clear to Pete that this animal, this creature, was of nocturnal nature, but in its stare, he found himself helpless. His heart skipped. First, it was a palpitation, then he could feel a searing pain in his left arm. He clutched his chest, but his feet remained adhered to the ground, and it was impossible to look away from those yellow, unmarked eyes. Its gaze came closer still, and in the pain that it brought, Pete knew he was going to die. To be found like Janet, cold, face contorted, and the second victim of that which lived amongst the pines on that hill. The pain was now unbearable, but the paralysis removed the possibility of a scream. What little light there was from the fireplace now illuminated its head, elongated on one side and pulsating on the other, its face dominated by a large dark hole, which appeared in place of a mouth or nose, one which no light could penetrate. As its boil-ridden head stooped to meet its own and the hole in its face almost touched his mouth, an involuntary sneer pulled his lips up to reveal his teeth as his face contorted into an entirely unnatural position. Then that one word. A word so powerful, so pure, that even the most evil of intentions could be dispelled by it. Daddy? With the snap of wood, the gargoyle-like creature turned its wide yellow gaze to Lana. Standing at the bottom of the stairs in her pajamas, her scream echoed out into the night. Arms outstretched, its odd-numbered fingers moved with a stutter as its moss-covered legs groaned, carrying it forward in a peculiar, unbalanced motion towards her. Now Lana was paralyzed by its stare, and with each step closer, her face contorted more fiercely, and the pain in her chest brought her to the point of unconsciousness. As intense as its ancient gaze was, it was focused. So focused that it did not notice Pete clawing his way across the floor towards the kitchen. The wooden creature's unsure movements made it appear more like a puppet than a thing of autonomous purpose, and as it reached Lana, it cupped her face in its uneven hands and stared wide-eyed and pupilless into her face. Tears streamed down her cheeks. The sound of feet running filled the air, and as it twisted to investigate, a loud crack was heard as Pete ran up onto the couch, jumping high into the air, bringing Janet's axe down deep into its spine. No blood ran or gushed, but a plague of unfamiliar insect-like critters poured out of the wound. Instead of a howl of pain, the creature emitted a crescendo of strange squeals and clicks before throwing Pete to the ground and smashing through the back door. Lana's father gave chase, but it was impossible as the wooden creation moved at an unimaginable pace, gliding on the ground with each stride, leaving no footprints in the snow. After a visit to the nearest hospital, both Lana and her father were given a clean bill of health.
But they never returned to that house filled with memories of the good times, the happy times, of a mother, a wife, a kind soul, of birthdays and weddings, and of course, of Christmas time. Pete didn't know what that creature was, whether it was alive or dead, or something else entirely inconceivable to human mind. But he made a solemn promise to himself from that moment on, never again would he cut down a tree, decorate it, and take enjoyment in its appearance as it died. Because no matter how pretty they are, no matter how much warmth they might give, no matter how much they might make people think of Christmas, you just don't know what may be living inside. The end.